Butterfly, butterfly, pretty butterfly. When I see you flap your wing, I know when it's time for spring. Butterfly, butterfly, pretty butterfly.
Welcome back to Honest Participants Only, a podcast that is meant to be honest, relatable, and just fabulous, really. Today we've got Dr Marie-Claude in the studio with us. I say us, it's just me, really. But I am so excited to have this conversation. We're having the conversation in honour of Black History Month, but we're doing it a little bit differently. We're going to do something called Creating Black History. And the reason we're going to be doing that is because we want to make sure that the history we're creating today is something that future generations can look back on. So when they have their Black History celebrations, we want them to be able to say, these people, these communities, these trailblazers made a difference. So, hello, Marie-Claude.
Hey, hi Shae. Thank you so much for having me. It really means a lot to be here, because for you to invite me is special. Thanks.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you here. I'm going to start off with accolades because we want to get those out the way, right? In the sense that this is you. So you're multi-award winning, I can't say it, multi-award winning insights expert, female founder, specialist in diversity, inclusion and equality, dedicated to making organizations more inclusive. However, I know that you're way more than that. I know that you're dedicated to improving the lives of a range of communities, your own,
Right.
mine, so much more than that. So give us a tiny bit of...
I guess that's the LinkedIn.
Yeah, that's exactly where I got it from.
So for LinkedIn, it's about making organizations more inclusive. In my life, it's about making life feel better and increasing opportunities for more people, and just using whatever skills, experience I have to try and address inequalities, because I know that this is not serving anybody, even the people who are benefiting from these inequalities. Actually, I don't think it's serving anybody particularly well. Certainly not the more vulnerable people within that.
So to the audience, I want you to know that it may feel weird to have a white professional on the panel, or not on the panel, on podcast for Black History Month. But everything that Marie-Claude just said is exactly why we need to have this conversation. I was explaining to her before that I want people to be able to look back and understand that it wasn't just our community that were trying to make a difference. And some of the things we're going to touch on today will absolutely be about allyship and how people can help. So today's theme is actually, how can non-Black people support in the writing of our history? And that's a really, really important question, because we are, in our community, we can potentially be very powerless to completely write history. We all know that Black history is kind of written from the perspective of those in power or the victors. So what we want to do is change that narrative today and kind of impact what the future will look like. Okay. So, as I said, you are award winning. Your most recent award, the MRS Impact Award. You won this award under one of the companies that you work for, or that you founded as well, in fact. So Versity is an inclusive brand, and you basically, can you just tell us a tiny bit about what happened with that and why that happened?
The award in particular. So yes. So as I said, inequalities bother me, and at the heart of that, I think ethnic and economic inequalities and health inequalities. And I just think something is wrong when people are having really negative experiences based on the color of their skin, their gender, things that they are, where they're born, things that are really outside of their control. So COVID-19, this project, just to give you a bit of background. So COVID-19 had just started, the pandemic had started, lockdown had kicked in for about a month. And already in the news, we were getting lots of information about young people getting unemployed at a really fast rate, losing their work. The industries where they were working were closing down, whether it's, leisure, hospitality, retail, etc. Generally, because ethnic minority people in particular start at a lower base economically, especially Black people and Black Caribbean people within that, and Bangladeshis and Pakistanis, because they start at a lower financial base, the impact of losing a chunk of their income was even greater on these families. And I thought something needed to be done about that. So I approached an organization called the Youth Futures Foundation. That's a big kind of endowment charity. Its purpose is to structure the youth employment sector so that more young people can access and keep good jobs. And I thought, I asked them what they were doing specifically to address ethnic inequalities in the impact of COVID-19 on young people. And they said, we know that this is a big issue. We haven't got a program of work for that. And I said, okay, let me put together a proposal. I did. And we did the research. But the reason we got the award is not just because this program generated really interesting insights into the lived experiences of young people as they are going through this pandemic and how it's impacting on so many aspects of their lives. And it's been hard and heartbreaking for me to see that. But the award was because I created, I can say that, I think, a kind of a blueprint for doing more inclusive research. So the idea was to recruit people that were from a range of ethnic minority backgrounds, mainly young people, but you were also part of this project, so that as we were giving a voice to young people from diverse backgrounds, we were also enabling that conversation to take place by having peer-led research, basically people with a very similar profile who could just as well have been on the other side of the table in a sense. So that as a process worked really well, and it was I think it was rewarded because it was a bold thing to do. But also, again, I knew that this pandemic was taking its toll on employment, and I wanted the project to be an opportunity to give more young people a kind of a step up on the employment ladder, to teach them how to do qualitative research, online research, give them some kind of safeguarding training, just make sure that they were enabled to then become more autonomous and progress in their career in the best way I could think of in this small project.
There were so many things. There were so many things that you said in there that I wanted to jump on, and we'll get to them shortly. But just the fact that you were able to approach an organisation and say, actually, I see a gap. This is something that I think that needs to happen, but also it's something I can help you with. What makes you? What's the question? What makes you feel that? Or what is it that makes companies listen to you? That's what the question is.
So many different things. So you're right. For one thing, you're absolutely right. In fact, I've done a similar thing with Macmillan Cancer Support, which is how our paths crossed in the first place. I approached them and I said, what are you doing about ethnic inequalities in cancer care experiences? I did that for RNIB. What are you doing about public attitudes towards blind people and partially sighted people? I've done that for Youth Futures Foundation. This is something I do. And actually, I'm very proud of the fact that every time I do that, we are finalists for 1, 2, 3, 4 different awards. So it's really kind of exciting. I clearly, so why? I think it's because when I approach an organization, I have really identified a need that they recognize as a need, and they recognize that they haven't done anything about. So that's one thing. I think I'm tapping into an agenda that is now really recognized to be really important. I think I'm white, so I'm not scary. So I can speak a radical language in a sense, but the envelope is non-threatening, right? I've got a PhD from the London School of Economics, so it's kind of, I'm credible. I've got the trappings of kind of credibility, I think. And I really have done work in that space for 25 years. And I am an expert, which doesn't mean that I can speak instead of or on behalf of. But the process I put forward is always one that is enabling people who never or rarely have a seat at the table to speak for themselves. And then I'm just packaging that in a way that makes sense for clients, right? So it's who I am for real. It's how people perceive me. It's the issues that I raise and the approach that I suggest. So it's I think. You tell me, is there anything else? Have I missed anything else?
No. I think that sums it up really, really well. And you touched on something that I want to move on to. You said, I'm white, and so therefore, I can't remember the actual phrase you used, but that means that you're not scary. Absolutely. And I think, let's talk about the elephant in the room. That is so true. I believe that if I had your experience or background, but I went in as me, I may not achieve the same outcome. And I may well. I'm sure that there are lots of Black professionals, and I'm a Black professional as well. We go into lots of spaces, and we're able to have certain conversations, especially now since last year, since George Floyd, and there are a lot of things that were brought back up to the surface, because let's not pretend they were brought to light. This is the everyday lived experience of my people. But since then, we've probably been able to do it a little bit more. But there is this elephant in the room that I may not have the same power to empower my people as somebody else who is not from the community. And that is really interesting to me. And I really appreciate you acknowledging that about yourself. That doesn't mean that obviously you don't have experience of any kind of discrimination or that kind of background. You are a woman, a professional woman. So your seat at the table is below, middle-class white men, which is sad to me, because not all middle-class white men are bad or negative or stereotypical or misogynistic. But generally, this is society and how we know it to be. You also were married to a Muslim man. I hope you don't mind me explaining that. So your children are mixed race. And so, you have all of this experience of a bit of understanding of being someone or an organization being non-inclusive. And that really all matters. But what do you think?
Can I just add a little something? Because I think it is important that I come from Canada, and that the cultural attitudes to diversity are just really, really different. It doesn't mean there's no sexism, there's no racism, Islamophobia, all of these things, they still exist. There are, there's a myth that, Canadians are so open. No, not entirely, but oh my God, it's a very different discourse around equality. And, people are happy to pay their taxes in a way that, there's a way in which redistribution feels fair or fairer than here. So I think the Canadian experience really does make me who I am in this case. I would add that to the mix.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to actually ask you that question. I'm going to ask you what gets you out of bed in the morning, what motivates you to do this type of work. But I'll come back to that in just a second, because the question today, as we know, is how can non-Black people support in the writing of our history? And fundamentally, in the work that you're doing, and in the acknowledgement of the fact that we can't do it in a silo on our own, are there some answers to that, do you think, coming from what we've just spoken about a little bit? Because we'll visit the question again as we go through. But yeah.
So how can we help in writing a better history? I think it's a really difficult, to be honest, I think it's a really difficult situation for a lot of people like me, whose hearts are in the right place, right? And who do want to do something. I have formal expertise I can bring, right? But a lot of people don't have that expertise. They just have a good heart. They can see the inequalities. They've now actually understood, a lot of people have started to really understood with George Floyd's death that quite that on the one hand, racism can be brutal, in your face, impossible to wrap your head around, right? So that, like, we've seen that murder over 9 seconds of it. So I think that shook the world's consciousness, but it's also raised awareness of something, of course, I've been talking about for 25 years and others before me, but that was not understood before, which is structural or systemic inequalities. That it's quite independently of how somebody treats you, whether they are abusive or kind, or what their attitudes are, that actually, independently of individual behavior, there are structural factors that mean that some people don't have the same chances as others. So I think that's a really enormous change in the discourse that George Floyd's murder has enabled. Now, it doesn't, so that means that maybe more people like me and others want to help, want to do something. And then we're all finding ourselves, I think, in this really difficult space between being an ally and being a white savior. You know, do we have to come in and save poor Black people from all these experiences? What's our role? How do we navigate that? And it's quite, it's hard, actually. And for me, it's more about, I'm sure there are different answers to this, but for me, it's more not speaking on behalf of, but it's enabling other people to have a seat at the table and to speak in their own voice. And it's a little bit, I was listening to something about this wonderful Radio 4 show, Women's Hour, which used to be led by a man. Now, I'd rather not have a man lead Women's Hour. I'm a woman, I can speak for myself. However, I'm very grateful for the man who approached the BBC and said, can we have a show about Women's Hour, about women for 1 hour in the week? Could we? So that to me is allyship, to say, let's talk about these issues, but then to allow women to talk about their own issues is where you step out of that conversation and you let women do it, right? So that's the way I think about helping around racial inequalities and racial justice. It's about using my expertise, my skills, my status, my power, my access in order to facilitate better conversations.
Yeah. Let me ask you this then. Do you think that ability for a man to step in and make room for, or for a white person to step in and make room for, or for an able-bodied person to step in and make room for, do you think then that is wholly dependent on the enablers? And when I say that, I mean the person at the head, the person in power, on their acceptance or understanding of the issue.
Yes.
So if I say, it's hard to be Black because the mic doesn't work for me in the same way, and you're like, but the mic works fine, I can hear you fine. It is and I'm asking you to help me, or I'm not asking, or you see that there's a need. Is that dependent on your objective view that the mic is or isn't fine? Does that make sense?
It really helps to arrive equipped with loads of data. It really helps to say, listen, objectively, whatever that means, right? Objectively, we have these disparities here, 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 here. And the problem you have as an organization, and where I can help you, is to understand why that gap is and what you can do about it. Now, whether the person cares about the gap, I can't do anything about. If that person does not care about the gap, then there's a limit, and I can make the case all I want. Yes, people say, yeah, there's a gap. Okay. But so I need somebody, an interlocutor within an organization who says, I care about this. And once they care for real, and that means allocating some budgets and having, senior people overseeing a brief, then change really happens. But I can't make people want more than they want, you know.
So how do we get people who don't care to care? I know there's some education around this for the community to take, but again, we've had this conversation before. I'm not sure that the onus should only be on the shoulders of the community because it's exhausting and traumatic. It shouldn't even necessarily be on an ally like you because you are out there, you're doing the work, you have to walk the balance of making sure that you're not in white savior mode or not in, minimizing mode or whatever, in order to get the work done and to be here. So you're hearing from both sides, the organizations, the professionals, whatever, and you're hearing from the communities and whatever, and you're having to combine all of that and make sure that you're getting the right balance of that. But one of the parts of that, is speaking to the people in power or the people in the C-suites and the people with access to the budget or whatever, and educating them on the need to care. Is that possible? How do we get people to care who don't yet care?
This is where I think facts help at one level, but actually, fundamentally, I think it's about empathy. It's not just a rational understanding. It's bringing. Do you remember we went to Warsaw? Of course, you'll remember, right? We went to co-present at the European Pharmaceutical Market Research Association, big conference, whatever. And the theme of that conference was about patient experiences. And I'm sorry to say, but there wasn't one patient in the room. So I contacted the organizers and I said, well, if you don't mind, I could introduce you to one patient who's wonderful.
We made history. We made history. Like it's a no-brainer to us.
It's not so difficult, but you don't know the work in the background, but to get you to be in that room and to reassure people that you would be the splendid speaker that you were. And I mean, I know you've made a difference to people in that room. I know they got it. And that's different. It's that click where you go, huh, it all makes sense. And I find that what I deliver generally, and what we co-delivered on that day, but generally what we deliver is something where people can't really push back and say, they're just a little bit weird. They're like, yeah, absolutely, that makes complete sense. It's just having presented information where people go, yeah, I totally get it. Of course, if it were me, I'd be behaving exactly in the same way. So it's overcoming this otherness, the idea that they are somehow different and they are difficult. And I think once you just shine a light on the rationality behind what people are saying, that it's not irrational, it's not people with a bee in their bonnet. It's like, look, there's a real case here, let's hear it. And that's all I do. I just say, I've gathered these stories here, let's hear them.
I was literally just about to touch on storytelling. So fundamentally, and I say this a lot, it's combining the head and the heart, right?
Yeah.
So the head being the data, and I've got a statement to make about data in a minute, but the head being the data and the heart being the story. On my LinkedIn, I describe myself as a story protector, and people have asked me, oh, what does that mean? I looked online. I had one person who asked me to speak say, I looked online and I couldn't find the description for story protector. I'm like, first of all, I make up a lot
Forget
of words. And secondly, actually, story protecting comes from my vast experience of being an advocate, whether it be for my race, whether it be as a patient, a cancer patient, whether it be, as a professional who's trying to get in the room. And story protecting is much more about protecting the principles and the fundamentals of somebody's story. So keeping the integrity of what they've shared so that people who are listening don't rewash or repaint that story because of their own lens. As people, as humans, we recognize in people's stories the parts that are most either convenient or familiar to us. Nobody should get into trouble for that. That's literally just human nature, it's psychology. But what we want to make sure we're doing is keeping the integrity of the story that then supports the data that then enables us to move forward. And I think, with everything you've just said, that kind of brings us back to the question, how can non-Black people support in the writing of this history? Because fundamentally, you're right, it's about bringing in some of the experiences and stories, keeping their integrity, and then saying, this is what we did, or this is what we can do, or, I'm not here to be the expert on the experience, but I'm here as an expert in social psychology or whatever it is the person, the ally is doing, and moving that forward, I guess. I wanted to make a statement on data. I always have a problem with data, but not because it's not important. It is hugely important, really, really important, especially for telling a story by those who only understand that language, right? But when I'm in so many rooms, sat on so many boards and that type of thing, I find that people in power depend on the data so much so that they miss the point sometimes, and that also in gathering their data, they're asking the wrong question. So of course their data is going to tell them what they want to see or something that's easy for them to deal with. The data is only as valid as the questions that are asked. So if you ask me, how am I feeling? I'm like, oh, I'm fine, thanks. But what you should have been asking is, your bad leg, how is that? Because if I live with a bad leg consistently, then I'm just going to say fine because it's not flared up today. It always hurts. But what you really want to know is about that bad leg. It's about the way we ask the questions that get us to the real heart of the issue. So that's not me discounting data. Data is important. Qualitative, quantitative, it's all important. But I feel like we also need to be getting to the issue of asking the right questions as well. What do you think about that?
I mean, and yeah, so from people often think about expertise in relation to research with people from various minority groups as just putting the right bums on seats, right? Finding these elusive, hard to reach people.
Love that phrase.
Wonderful, right? And kind of exotic people, exotic birds that are so hard to reach, right? And I'm like, that's not the issue. That is clearly one of the issues. You might want to ask yourself, why is it that some people have historically not had a voice and taken part in research exercises and completing the census and all this stuff that's so, the labor force survey and all sorts of important sources of data. But for me, it's first and foremost, it's actually identifying the problems, and that requires expertise and lived experience up to a point, but certainly expertise. It's asking the right questions. It's recruiting the right people, for sure. So that's finding the hard to reach people, but they might not be hard to reach, actually. Maybe people might be perfectly willing to take part in research. It's designing the research in a way that is inclusive, so doesn't rule out some people from taking part, but also inclusive in the ways in which the topics are addressed, in the sensitivity around the issues, the terminology, and the assumptions that are made about the issues that need to be covered in the research, and leave loads of space for people to determine what are the issues that truly matter to them, outside of what the original research agenda might have been, right? And it's this kind of, and then it's analyzing in a way that actually picks up on the subtleties of what people are saying, it's not, if you do a lot of consumer research, sometimes it's just saying, well, 30% of people like a blue packaging and 20 like red. So that's one thing. But if you do so, for the research that I've done with RNIB, so it's not about Black history, but it's a good example. This was about understanding, and it could be about race, but how public attitudes towards blind people end up really limiting their life experiences and opportunities. And the key to unlocking the notion of public attitudes here was to say, actually, members of the public, they're not nasty, they're not invested in being against blind people. A, they lack empathy, and B, importantly, they think of blind people in terms of some archetypes of an innocent, of a victim, of a superhero with amazing kind of skills and whatever, or in some rare cases as everyman, as an ordinary person like you, like me, just with a little functional deficit that we need to help with. And from the moment, but nobody says in the data, in an interview, in a survey, oh, yes, I think of blind people in terms of the innocent archetype. That's where my expertise comes in. And it's actually looking at this wealth of data and going, actually, I hadn't thought about archetypes for 20 years, but I think that's what's at play here. And this is where it's experience, right? It's and once that's understood, then a whole range of organizational outcomes can unfold, as we've seen with RNIB in this case, really.
Yeah.
So it's about, so to go back, it's about asking the right questions, recruiting the right people, engaging them in the right way, analyzing in a way that is actually powerful and makes sense, and then making the right recommendations off the back of that. And all of these components must be aligned to do some really impactful research and change things, really. And right
Again, yeah, no, again,
in a different way.
this absolutely answers some of that question. We knew that we wouldn't be able to definitively answer this, right? We're just what we're doing here is just a teardrop in the ocean of our future and generations to comes past. But fundamentally, I think all of that feeds in again to this question: how can non-Black people support the writing of this history? And it's so pertinent that there are so many points at which we all have impact. We all have, autonomy over the things that we choose to do that will either positively or negatively impact the next person, whether it be about race or whether it just be about being kind to somebody as you're passing them to get onto the tube or something. This has been a really great conversation about this, and again I want to reiterate that we haven't come to any conclusions, and we're unlikely to, because if we could in one episode or come up with all the answers, the world would be entirely different, trust me, because I've got the drive and the passion to make it work, and I know you do too, but we're just not that privileged to be able to have all the answers. But I did say to you before that I wanted to ask you a question. So what is it that gets you out of bed in the morning to do this type of thing? Are there days when it all just feels too heavy and you may not want to do it? Or is this just so innate in you that you bound out of bed to make a difference?
It's easier for me to get out of bed and want to make a difference because ultimately I'm not the one who's traumatized by this. Right? So I don't need to take a break from it all and go, I just can't deal with this. All I can do is actually, I use, in a sense, it doesn't sound good to say that, but I use my anger at injustice to get me out of bed. But it's not as painful to me to do it as it would be for somebody whose everyday experience is to be on the receiving end of discrimination. So for me, my anger is just a motivation. And yes, I get out of bed with that, and I start my morning every day with reading the newspapers, and that fires me up for more work to be done.
It's so funny because we've had conversations about this before where you've been more angry on behalf of me and my people than I have been. And I think you just you hit the nail on the head when you said, you don't have to necessarily be traumatized by it. There's a version of trauma that happens for people who get it and see it and they're feeling it on behalf of. But I think when the microaggressions and all of the things are part of your everyday lived experience, anger exhausts. And I think that in to wrap up this conversation, a combination of your anger, as you know, with balance, so that it's not kind of overtaking the issue, because that stops being allyship and moves into white saviorship. Not that that's what I'm saying what you're doing, but generally for anyone listening to this who also is like, yeah, I'm angry too, I want them to be careful of that. But I think it's that combination of our desire and willingness to step up at times, not every single time, because I think we need to be sensible and not take on every single battle or fight, combined with your anger and insight and understanding about what things could be, or well, why can't you have what I have, or why can't I have what the boss man has, or you know, all of those things. All of that combines to write a history that has not yet been written. And I think I would love in 5 or 10 years for us to have this same conversation, but flip it.
I would also add that in my motivations and getting up out of bed in the morning, there's one very intellectual, maybe, motivation, but I am a social psychologist and a sociologist, so I'm not going to pretend that I'm not. But Michel Foucault, who is the guy who famously wrote something about knowledge is power, right? So
yeah, I mean, to most of us, it's just a quote on the internet, but
yeah,
I mean, it matters. But I never knew the author.
So Michel Foucault, great French intellectual, but what he did and applied that to a range of issues, madness, quote unquote, is definitely one of them, but it's what he called an archaeology of knowledge. And he saw his role as a philosopher, social scientist, as digging for all the knowledges that had been subjugated because they were eclipsed by the victors writing history, right? And I know that I see my role as digging, as being an archaeologist of in the present, not in the past, but of like bringing different knowledges to light. You know, they don't have to have been. I'm not a historian in that sense, but I'm a sociologist, and I know that in today's world there are plenty of voices that are subjugated, and I can use my position, knowledge, whatever, access, power to bring that to light.
Thank you so much. I hope this work continues. I hope that our work together continues. I hope that, again, in 10 years, we can have this conversation. Where can the people find you if you want to connect, or if they, you know, they want to tap into your insight or your knowledge? Where can they find you?
I think LinkedIn is probably the best place, actually.
Yeah, excellent.
You can get in touch on LinkedIn. I have, there aren't too many Dr. Marie-Claude Gervais specialists, multi-award winning, whatever,
Yes.
insights experts.
Exactly. Let's just put that up again. Exactly. Look for it. I took this from LinkedIn, so look exactly for this when you're looking for him. You'll have the right one. Marie-Claude, thank you so much for being here. I know it could have been, before we had a conversation, it could have been a really vulnerable space, because talking about race when you're not from the race can always potentially be a minefield. But you've been fantastic, and I've really enjoyed our conversation. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Shae, for inviting me today, but also your trust and patience with me over the years, and then generosity. Thank you.
No problem.
Butterfly, butterfly, pretty butterfly. When I see you flap your wing, I know when it's time for spring. Butterfly, butterfly, pretty butterfly.